Okay, ready to go. Um, okay, for those who are in the Hangout, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Andrea, for getting up so early. It's 7 a.m. here in Quito and Lima, 1 p.m. in London, and some other time wherever somebody else is. Thank you very much for those who are watching through the web stream. Whether you are on the website or Jeff, can you watch it on YouTube as well, or just the On Think Tank's website? I think we'll start this first webinar on methods to study research. The series of webinars, which started with a pre-launch a month ago in London, will be running through September and October, and it might extend to November if we have more people wanting to join in. This first webinar is being run by Marcos Gonzalez-Hernando, and he's a PhD student from University of Cambridge, and he's going to be talking to us about methods for studying think tanks, focusing on, and I just want to get this right, case studies, quantitative methods, and diachronic perspectives. Next, in a couple of weeks, we'll have a presentation focusing on social network analysis, which will also be quite interesting. And then 2 weeks later, we'll be talking about quantitative methods, including surveys, to study think tanks. So please join us in those events. You can sign up on the On Think Tank's website through the event through its Eventbrite page. Okay, so today we're having Marcos he's going to talk to us for about 15-20 minutes. If you have any questions and you're not in the Hangout, then you can ask those questions on the website itself. There's a comments box. Jeff Kenesovich and myself will be monitoring that for your questions, or by using the hashtag #TTmethods on Twitter, and we'll be monitoring that too to get your questions and pass them on to Marcos. Okay, so that should be it. We'll try to keep this webinar to under an hour, and when it's done, it will be recorded and uploaded to the On Think Tank's website for you to watch later on. And if you have any questions, then don't hesitate to add them in the comment box or using the hashtag #TTmethods as well. Okay, Marcos, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Kike, for the presentation, and thanks for the opportunity to present which is basically my the methodology for my PhD in this environment. I'm really looking forward to hearing the feedback from the commentators and from people interested in this sort of issues. Okay, so to start with, so Jeff, can you please change the slide? 1 second. Well, let's talk a bit about the think tanks themselves. One thing that came across very forcefully in the last webinar we had in the introduction was the difficulties that are obvious, difficulties that are pervasive in studying think tanks and how to define them, and basically understanding what is actually the purview and what is the institutional niche. So building on that ambiguity and the fact that think tanks very often, it's better to study them in terms of how they behave rather than working with any very strict definition. From that, for the design of a qualitative study, one could say that there are several hurdles that one has to overcome. The first one, of course, is, and this is pervasive throughout the literature, the institutional diversity that think tanks have. So we can have, of course, think tanks associated to universities, things associated to business interests, things associated to political parties, etc. So that, in a sense, puts particular hurdle that any qualitative study on think tanks has to overcome, because of course that means that it's very difficult to compare things that are absolutely different from each other. Then the second one is instability and heteronomy, which has to do basically with the fact that think tanks tend to be quite sensitive to what's happening outside of them. In my own research, I study think tanks' institutional and intellectual reactions to the economic crisis. That is absolutely the case with think tanks, for instance, that had no expertise, no in-house expertise on macroeconomics, for instance. At late 2008, early 2009, found that they really needed in-house economists to intervene in these areas that became salient in the public discourse, of course. That's one example. Another example could be, I don't know, in my own country, Chile, for instance, after 2011, there were massive student protests that, in a sense, brought about a political crisis that think tanks both on the left and on the right had to react to, for instance. Another thing that we have to take in mind when studying think tanks is going back to the issue of definition, is that we can understand them also as different things, and that depends on the way that we define them, of course. So, for instance, we can think if we think that think tanks are more of political actors, then we might research them as elite actors and members of elites. If we think of think tanks more as researchers, we might research them more in the context of knowledge producers and knowledge streams, for instance. And if we think of them more as lobbyists, etc., as purveyors of interest, of particularistic interests, etc. Another last hurdle that we have to take into account when studying think tanks is the amount of outputs and the different sources of data that these organizations have. Most think tanks profit from having a certain level of publicity, or profit from having a relative amount of the stuff that they produce in the public domain, because in general one of the aims is to influence the public discourse, of course. So in that sense, you can find very easily from any think tank, particularly in the US and the UK, for instance, fellows writing books that are associated with the think tank, policy reports, of course, parliamentary interventions, in some more technocratic think tanks, they produce indicators, for instance, blogs, of course, op-ed pieces, media appearances, etc. So there's quite a lot to draw from. Can you please change the slide, Jeff? Okay. Thanks. So in my own case, I study the economic crisis. I decided to focus on case study methodologies, which basically means that I chose 4 think tanks defined by different variables, and basically, in my case, I decided for a left-leaning think tank, for a more free market-leaning think tank, for another thing that's closer to a political party, and for a think tank that is more technocratic. They are the New Economics Foundation, the Adam Smith Institute, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and Policy Exchange. So what I try to do there is to get the greatest amount of representativity in the least amount of cases, because the volume of information these organizations produce is absolutely massive. So, and the other thing is that with these different sort of institutions, that allowed me to, I think, produce a comparative framework that would allow me to see different changes across different business models. Of course, they're not representative, but I think that it's a good exploratory way of starting to understand how different funding regimes and how different changes in the public discourse affect think tanks that are positioned in different ways. In that sense, the fact that I'm focusing on cases and following these cases and following the trajectory of these 4 cases allows me, I think, to be a bit more sensitive to different dynamics in the public discourse, and it allows me a bit more to see processes of self-reflexivity, I would say, in the sense that think tanks sometimes change their approach to tackle the problems in the economic crisis. And that in a sense, so it's a narrative of narrative, if you like. That's more or less what I wanted to achieve. Also, what allows me to do to focus on these case studies is to use different sources of data. Of course, for think tanks in the UK, for instance, data from the Companies House or Charities Commission, it's very important that you want to get it from them, of course, and because these reports for these official houses actually give you, depending on the think tank, of course, a relatively decent amount of information for the funding that allows you to trace changes in the structure of funding, of course. And in the case of these 4 think tanks that are representative of a particular almost ideal type, it allows you to see changes in what's actually happening in the funding regimes as well. So, but one risk that has been brought to my attention, I think is very important, is that although these changes are in this sort of research are seen through one case study, one at a time, there is a risk of overlooking actually that, for instance, there is a broader intellectual change towards focusing on a particular form of, for instance, free market discourse that are happening elsewhere. For instance, in one of the organizations that I studied at the Institute, they have produced a lot of reports and information that are inspired by what is called bleeding heart libertarianism, which is actually a discourse that was brought up from the United States. It's not particularly from within the think tank, so sometimes it tends to overplay the autonomy of each of the institutions. That's one risk I have to be aware of. Please continue, Jeff. So in terms of the unit of analysis, and this has to do with the fact that I come from a background from sociology of intellectuals. In this literature, there's been a turn in the past 5 years, more or less, away from trying to define what an intellectual is, sort of similar to from what think tanks, away from trying to define these intellectuals towards trying to define what is an intellectual intervention. So define, in a sense, it's a performative turn of how we understand intellectuals. So instead of looking at think tanks themselves and how they define themselves, I try to look at what they do and what they publish and where they publish it and how they position themselves through what they publish. So the main unit of analysis is the policy report, because in a policy report, of course, you have very often a funder, a research team, you have a policy area, there's a particular focus, a research method, etc. It says a lot about a think tank, particularly if you, for instance, in my case, I work with spreadsheets and collect all of these policy reports from a particular think tank. Then that allows also for the use of coding and data analysis. If you're familiar with working with NVivo or Atlas DI, I think this sort of research allows to work with these sort of frameworks quite easily. In my case, I use grounded theory, but for understanding and interpreting these reports. But other people might use other approaches, such as discourse analysis, etc. And some of these tools, for instance, NVivo also allows for content analysis, for working with images, and all the rest of it. So that's quite interesting. That's something that you have to. Yeah, there's a lot of different options that you could add onto it. That's, I think, one big advantage of what I'm doing. Well, again, all the sources. So you have the Charities Commission reports, press coverage, of course, for a particular report, for instance. If a report is particularly important, you can look at how it was covered through the press, and then look at actually what followed after that report. Same with blog posts. And one of the risks that I wanted to mention is that for certain institutions, institutions that, for instance, rely on the work of fellows, very often they have they control a bit less the work that these fellows produce, because in general these fellows are unpaid. This happens, for instance, in the UK with the IEA, that publishes work of fellows without that are, I mean, they're kindred spirits. They have become fellows for a reason, but that doesn't mean that they are talking on behalf of the institution. And on the other hand, for instance, something like a blog might become more important for them because it's updated every day, for instance, and that might mean that if you want to look at how the institution thought of the problems of the economy throughout the crisis, it might be better to look at the block. So that's something to take into account, that depending on the institutions, a particular types of output might be more or less representative. That on the one hand. And on the other, this requires, there is a big risk here, which is that when looking at these organizations, there's a lot of material, there's a lot of stuff already published. You need to be able to distinguish what is a core and a peripheral sort of report. That means basically to understand which reports are more central for the mission and the message that this think tank wants to put across to a polity. That means, for instance, that think tanks that are focused on, I don't know, a think tank that produces, for instance, a report that is founded on a very specific issue, that report in particular might not be that central, but it's important that it's there because of course, it's funding for them. So there's definitely a hurdle there that one has to take into account. And one way of going about it, and the way that I went about it, but there are others, of course, is through interviews. So Jeff, please, next slide. And these are, for instance, reports that were produced more or less at the same time in 2009, when people were starting to talk about new ways of understanding how the need for a reform in the banking sector and a broader reform in the way that we organize our parties. So, I mean, I've picked up 5 here, but yeah, you could have many more, and you could take a snapshot, but at the same time, take a look also at how each think tank changes through time. Please, Jeff, next slide. Okay, so elite interviews. One of the most important parts of what I did is I tried to work around interviews with people working at these think tanks. These interviews were quite targeted because I needed to work with people who were employees or former employees of these think tanks that were there between the years under consideration. So that means that sometimes they were in other countries, or had to have Skype calls, for instance. Other times that meant that they were in new jobs that made them a bit more difficult to contact, and that also says something about think tanks, of course, with like the trajectories of people. That's something else that you sort of start picking up on. But the main reason why I decided to have these interviews is to bridge the gaps between these interventions between each of these reports. So basically, what I would do is I'll send an email in which I would ask them for an interview in which they would basically tell me a story. That's basically what I wanted to hear from them. I wanted to hear what were they doing in the think tank when the crisis hit, and how the work developed, how the organization developed as they were there. So I'm mostly interested in moments and changes and looking at what they have to say. Of course, because of the problems of access, it's not going to be absolutely representative of each institution, but it's going to give me an idea of how the organization developed and how the priorities changed through time. There's a lot of nitty-gritty that we can talk a bit more about when preparing these interviews, how to approach people, where to look for them, etc. But I would also like to talk a bit about the possible pitfalls. The first one is access, of course, particularly with think tanks that are closer to political parties. I think they tend to be a bit more wary. But in general, it's relatively easy to find the people, and they're generally very happy to collaborate. That's one thing. That's a possibility that one has to be one has to take into account. Particularly in my case, because I had to do a lot of work before I contacted these people, so that I had some background to check their story, so to speak. So I needed intense preparation of each interview. The other risk is, of course, not taking into account that these people are also presenting a particular view of their think tank and the way that they would like to that their think tank to be portrayed. So please, Jeff, next slide. So I wanted to wrap up with some presentations of the advantages and shortcomings of this approach. I think one of the main advantages is that it allows for a depth of result. In the end, I'm producing, in my thesis in particular, it's 4 chapters, 4 empirical chapters, 1 for each institution, which allows for more information to be condensed there to take care of more sources of data, and which allows for a richer narrative of what actually happened. But of course, the counterpart of that is that the findings tend to be quite specific, and it's very difficult to scale them up. So in a sense, they're looking for qualitative representativity rather than statistical, of course. The second thing is, of course, that I wanted to make it a dynamic study so that I could trace changes across these institutions, which I think it's relatively new. I haven't seen many studies do that, and it's quite refreshing in my opinion. But at the same time, it conveys the risk that it's an ex post facto study, in the sense that we are talking about the past, and of course it's an unassailable level in which you can't reach the past. There's things have already been interpreted after they happen. So for the advantage of having the possibility of narrate is the counterpart of that is actually that the ability to narrate actually sometimes obscures previous narratives, so to speak. And finally, another of the advantages of my approach, I think, is that it allows me to be multidimensional and to grab useful information wherever I find it, because very often these think tanks, of course, the information that they find about how they change through time is going to come from different places and requires a lot of searching through the internet, etc. The counterpart of it, of course, is that there might be an inherent bias in the information that I select, and that is very difficult to avoid, of course. And I just wanted to wrap up with saying, what does this type of approach ultimately provide? It's a narrative of narratives, and hopefully a comparative analysis of how these institutions reacted in a particularly important moment of their history. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos. That was interesting. If I can just add a really quickly follow-up question before I open up the conversation. Can you tell us maybe 1 or 2 examples of things you found, like specific findings, to give those who are listening kind of a sense of what they might get out of this type of study, if they were to try to replicate it?
Okay, for instance, one thing that I've found is that within each think tank, I think there are inherent tensions.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
There are tensions within every think tank. For instance, within the left, there is a tension often between, say, environmentally focused approaches and growth-focused approaches, from more of the Keynesian tradition, so to speak. And these tensions tend to need to be resolved in some way, and very often, periods of crisis open the space for these tensions to be brought forward. Or, for instance, other types of tensions are tensions between people who believe that their think tank should work more as an advocacy organization, or people who think that their think tank should work more as an expert organization. Or another thing that I found, of course, is another find that I could mention is that different sources of funding, different ways in which these think tanks are funded, allows for different forms of intervention. For instance, think tanks that depend more on research contracts and on charitable institutions tend to produce more PDF reports that are looking for a certain particular aim, whereas think tanks that have more core funding, for instance, are more able to depending on the approach, either work directly in more policy relevant areas that don't really have that much funding available, or more closely visible with the media, for instance, publishing more on their blog, etc., and working more on like building a movement rather than producing reports for funders. That's another funding. And another third one I would mention is that around 2013, I think a lot of think tanks started looking at the issue of narrative, which I found fascinating. So, for instance, there are reports on framing the economy, on how to change the conversation about the economy, and that very often meant that these think tanks were looking at their own role in the policy-making process and the climate of opinion, so to speak.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll give Andrea and Jeff, of course, the chance to ask any questions if you have any. I've been jotting down a long list, but and by the way, I've been tweeting your presentation as you went on Think Tank's Twitter account. Andrea, you wanna ask anything or add your own comments?
Yeah, thank you, Marcos, for the presentation. It was very interesting. One question that I had is, well, this issue of the context where each think tank works is like a very important question, I think, for everybody around these organizations. And you mentioned just briefly that you were trying to have these think tanks working within the same context, in the sense that you would be able to compare them. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more of what sorts of things you consider in the context, and if then throughout the research that you started carrying out, you realized that even if think tanks work in the same country, they face different contexts, or if it maintained that they were indeed working in the same context. Because we will come back to, I'm sure we will come back to this when we hear Courtney's presentation and her work on context and think tanks. But there are so many dimensions there that it does raise this question for me, at least to the extent of if think tanks do work in the same context when they're working in the same country, or there are a lot of more specificities depending on the area or the policy that they are trying to change or so. So if you could just share more of this issue of context.
Okay, that's a very good point. I think I would say we should differentiate between the context when it comes to a research design and context when it comes to each think tank. I mean, for me at least, when I was designing this research, the context basically for me meant the same country. That we're working on similar issues. In my case, actually, I decided to focus on generalist think tanks, and I decided for that because these think tanks have more leeway on deciding on which policy areas to focus on, and of course, that's an important decision to take into account in a moment of crisis. But yes, I think you're right that these think tanks, one could claim that they belong to different contexts, in the sense that, for instance, one think tank that receives funding from academic sources, the SRC, is going to have a very different experience of the crisis than a think tank that receives core funding from undisclosed donors, for instance. So yes, I agree that that could be problematized, but at the level of research design, I thought that, in a sense, think tanks are able to choose their context in very often. I mean, at least these are more generalists, and that trying to work with 4 case studies across different contexts would have been a bit more difficult in terms of understanding changes. But I agree with your point, and I'm going to have another thought. Yeah, I'm going to have to think about it a bit more, I think.
I think it's interesting, though, now that you mention it, that you did include kind of like an external aspect to the context, that is that they are like in the same country, but also an internal, that they all share this characteristic of being generalist.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting because it keeps in line with the work of Courtney and Research for Development, of saying context is both inside and outside. So even if you did kind of choose that by including this generalist approach, so I think that's it aligns. So it's interesting.
Marcos, how would this work if you were to do this across countries? I mean, have you thought this is a possible follow-up for this work, or have you come across studies that attempt to do this? At considering the depth of your study and the issue of representativity of the cases, would this work? And given what Andrea just said, would this work if you were comparing different countries?
Well, I tried to do that actually originally with my own country, Chile, but I think the experience of the economic crisis in Chile and other countries was very different. So when you're trying to work with an event like that, it's very difficult to compare across contexts. If you were to do it in a more general way, although there is no time without events, so to speak, but if you were to do it in a more general way, you probably could, yes. But most studies of think tanks that compare contexts, as far as I know, tend to focus on the institutional dynamics, on the political framework of these countries, and the ways in which where think tanks can impact public policy, more than on changes. But maybe it could be done. Actually, after I finish my PhD, I'm working on postdoctoral research, which is going to try and focus on the institutional and intellectual changes that happened in things in my own country, Chile.
So if I can jump in, I think it's really interesting that you use the research report as a unit of analysis. And I know that you've said already, we've just been talking a lot about context, and that different types of funding models affect the different types of research reports that you're coming across. But I was wondering if within that time period, I mean, there's been a lot of changes within how communications and research communications have evolved in that time period. So I was just wondering if you've seen how those reports have changed over time. And then I was also interested in the concept of core versus periphery of and I guess I would be interested to hear how if you could elaborate a little bit on how you decided that the report was potentially peripheral. I know you talked a little bit about thematically, but I mean, are there things in terms of the way that the report is presented that make it peripheral, or, not all think tanks only have one style of research report. They might have briefings and many other types. So just kind of curious how you dealt with that as well. So a multifaceted question.
Okay, so changes in communication strategies and center periphery. With regards to the first question with communications, I would say definitely has changed. But I don't know if it's particularly something that is specific of think tanks or not. It might have changed outside as well. I don't know. But it seems to me that from 2007-8 to 2013, which is the years I focus on, of course, the rise of social media is quite important. And For instance, I've been looking at a lot of videos that started appearing in YouTube around 2009-10 that tried to present in a very didactic way what happened in the economic crisis. That became quite a fashionable thing. For instance, the RSA did quite a few in 2009-10, which became quite massive. Then Twitter, of course, became more important as well. And for instance, one think tank that I'm looking at, which tends to be much more, they didn't used to be as present in the media because they're more of a technocratic organization. If you see the reports, they actually keep tallies of how many times they're mentioned in the media, and because they produce macroeconomic reports from 2007 to 2009, the amount of times people were citing them skyrocketed. So that obviously changed the way that they presented themselves in the public domain. The way that, yeah, and it's sort of, in their case at least, I think it brought us to the realization that they didn't know what they said anymore. So that produced a different way of engaging with the public, I would say. With regards to the second question, the one on center periphery on reports. So yes, thematically is quite an important part of it, of course. And another thing is that many of these think tanks, not all, because they vary in size, many of them are divided in research teams. And if you look at the reports on these research teams, it's very often the case that, for instance, because they have a particular funding stream on, for instance, I don't know, public sector pay or community development finance or something particular, like relatively specific, you find a series of reports on that. At the same time, you find a larger report that, for instance, is quoted in several teams. In the case of the New Economic Foundations, there's this report called the Great Transition, which is basically it sort of serves as a blueprint that connects the work of different teams within the institution. So, of course, that's much more central. That on the one hand, and on the other, interviews, I think, are quite important. I mean, one of the first interviews I had, I showed the person a number of the publications, and I asked them, please tell me how you went from this publication to the next. And of course, in some of them, they were like, oh yeah, I wrote that because I was on a deadline, they had this amount of funding, we needed to do this, and yeah, we basically dispatched it. But for this one, we, for instance, spent a lot more time on, and we wanted to make a particular intervention, for instance, in the context of the Vickers report in that case. So I'd say it's very difficult to say a priori which report is more central than another, especially many of these institutions produce over 30 reports a year, if not more. But yeah, and as I said before as well, of course there are biases in the way that one selects things to weave together a story. But yeah, I don't think I can avoid them. I wish I could.
And can I ask one more basic question?
Yes.
I think I see that on the title of the presentation or of this session, it mentions diachronic perspectives.
Yeah.
And it could be that Kike came up with that word, but I suspect that you had something to do with that. But in your presentation, you didn't mention it exactly. So would you be, if going back to basics, would you be willing to kind of define what you mean by the diachronic perspectives?
Yeah, diachronic. Okay, diachronic, I mean as opposed to synchronic, which basically means a snapshot at a particular moment in time. Diachronic is trying to follow what's happening through a particular moment in time. You could choose several instances of a diachronic change, but I'm focused on an event that structures change, which for me is the economic crisis, which of course is followed by the austerity measures that followed. And that in a sense, that you could say is the shared context. Yeah, and it's bound though. That's the other thing that I don't presume to talk about the whole history of these organizations, just about the changes in this particular moment in time in both cases.
Great. Thanks, Marcos. Just almost a follow-up question from my first question, but it's interesting that you choose a crisis to look for change. And are there any significant changes that you found around these moments? So reactions to the context that the think tanks went through?
Yes. I mean, the first obvious one is that these think tanks tended to hire quite a few economists right after the crisis, particularly around 2009, because there was, of course, an open area in which you could shape public policy on the one hand, but you could also influence how people understood the crisis, and how people understood the crisis, of course, is a very important political objective, one could claim. So, of course, one important change in the beginning was that think tanks that didn't have a very big department of working on banking or working on macroeconomic policy suddenly did. And that is also in part because, for instance, the European Commission was funding research on the matter. Individual donors were interested in funding stuff on the matter, and people were, in general, interested. That's one obvious example. Of course, that reverberates very often, depending on the type of think tank, that some avenues of funding are more restricted than become a bit more restrictive than others. Of course, for instance, in one think tank, you find on a center-left think tank, you find more people moving away from working on environmental issues for a while at least, to focus more on financial matters. That's one important change in the beginning. Then, depending, of course, on the type of think tank, they have different reactions in different constituencies and different audiences once the austerity discourse hits and once the policies start to be implemented. So, for instance, some think tanks would focus more on on appearing with writing op-eds in favor of austerity, for instance, whilst others focus more on research that was funded, for instance, by charitable trusts on the local effects of austerity. And yeah, so there you start seeing where are the niches in which think tanks can work on, depending on how things change throughout time. And of course, when, for instance, the UK briefly lost the AAA rating in the beginning of 2013, also you have what you would expect to be the different reactions of these things at a particular moment in time. And as I mentioned before as well, these think tanks start, I think, around 2013 is more conspicuous, but even before, to be very aware of their own role within the policymaking domain and actually trying to convince people who weren't already convinced, so to speak, once you reach a kind of ideological deadlock, one could say. Yeah, that's what comes to mind now.
Great. No, thanks. That's very interesting, because when you look at other studies of the history of think tanks in around the world, if you take a long view, you realize that after different crises or different shocks, think tanks start to dedicate more time to trying to understand what happened and what role they might have played in the process. And you see that around, say, First World War, Second World War, in the US, and think tanks start to rethink their role. In Chile, as you mentioned, you'll be studying around the dictatorship before think tanks start to advocate for policy change. They start to think about what happened and how society has changed, and that requires them to hire new staff, look into new issues. And then what you say is interesting is that this is in a way limited by their funding structure. So some think tanks might be more flexible in terms of being able to hire or to change focus than others might have to be stuck in the past. And I guess, Jeff, that also reflects your question, where some think tanks might be able to try out new methods of communication and engagement, where others will probably have to stick with whatever the funders are asking for. And funders are never the most forward-looking, but some are. Any other questions, Andrea? Do you have any follow-up?
Yeah, I have one more follow-up. While you were describing the methods, you also brought up that this tension between the person or the expert as an individual versus the position as a think tank, right? And I think this is another practical question, because think tanks have this challenge of deciding, for example, if the think tanks that are starting or that are deciding how to spend their capacity development funding and stuff, some of them are like, well, if I spend too much energy on improving the positioning and the skills of these individuals, and then they might end up leaving the think tank, or and this tension then later also about to what extent the individuals can share a common position or not, and also if you got a sense that some of these tensions, the way some of the think tanks handle these tensions were better for their capacity to influence policy, like if they were if they had become more friends and had like a longer term relationship, they were more willing to do more like of these advocacy things, and the newer ones were more like just writing reports and staying a little bit more shying away from debates or something like that. These are just assumptions I'm making right now, but just to frame the question about how you saw this tension between the individual and the institution.
That's quite an interesting point. Thank you for that, Andrea. And yes, I agree. There's definitely a possible tension between the individual and the organization. I mean, very often in these organizations, I think, and when you look at them throughout the years, very often, if you want to trace an intellectual or institutional change, actually it's almost embodied in one person who came and took a particular approach, or came and convinced people that this was not the way that things should be done. I mean, some of them are quite visible, but others, because I'm not doing an ethnography or I'm not going inside the organization, I can't really talk that much about what's happening inside or what are the inner intentions. But you could definitely tell when you read the reports from one team or another, or when you look at the change that happened with a change of director, that there are changes within the think tank, because this think tank in the end is something that you talk in the name of, so to speak. It's a condensation of a team, in a sense. It's a condensation of a name that allows you to position yourself across space, across places, and that helps, and that can help both the think tank itself or the individual, depending on, of course, how the think tank itself is structured. But yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's massively important. Yeah, and it's
okay. Sorry. Hi, I keep forgetting to unmute or mute myself. Jeff, do you have any follow-up? No. Do we have anybody else?
I'm doing the same thing as you with mute. There's one comment online just saying thank you so much for sharing this information, but I'm not seeing much in the way of questions.
That's okay.
Yes, I've been tweeting, but I've seen a few retweets, but no questions yet. Anyway, it's a process. Let me just check my notes, because I think I wrote another small It's a small question. No, I think we've covered them. National comparisons and events. Great. Well, I mean that's it from me. Can I sort of ask over a practical question? More or less, how much time did you spend on each think tank? And if you were, and I know you were doing a PhD, but let's say there's somebody out there who would like to follow your approach, similar to study think tanks in the same depth that you did. How much time would it? Do you think you spend working on in average on those think tanks you reviewed?
I would say you need at least 3 months for think tank. At least 1 month to set up the spreadsheet with the publications, to take a look at the publications, to code some of the key ones, and to know who you have to contact. Another month to set up the interviews. Hopefully try and send the emails a bit earlier, but it's important for you to have done that work before you ask for the interviews. And from transcribing and for working on the on a draft of the document, in my case chapters, and another month to finish. And I think that was, I mean, you could probably try and speed it up, but if you're one person, I think that's a reasonable approach.
Yes. And do you think you know them by now?
I have a feeling about. I wouldn't say I know them absolutely, because of course I haven't worked inside of them and in them. But I would say that I know what they are more likely to say or less likely to say, or which areas they're more likely to focus on than others.
Okay. Yeah, that's useful. So about 3 months would be an appropriate time to study a think tank and understand, as you say, what they did in response to a crisis, but also why they did it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, we're just on time, so it's 7:57 by my clock, and I think Andrea and I probably need a coffee to make it through the rest of the day. Thank you very much, Marcos. Thank you, Jeff and Andrea, for joining, and thanks, Jeff, for managing the process. So this is it. This is the first session. October 5th, we have a second session where we'll be looking at social network analysis. 2 weeks later, we'll have one looking at quantitative methods, looking particularly at the study of context. So I think we'll probably come back to some of the questions we had today. Okay. For those who are watching the video, well, you've already found it, so that's great. If you have any questions, please add them to the question box on the blog, or use the hashtag TT methods to ask us any questions. You'll see some of the questions and answers that we've had today, and also my kind of live tweeting of the event, of the presentation. Okay. Well, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And have a good day, Marcos.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.